The wind came down off the Bitterroot front that November, with nothing to slow it, and Sarah Quinn stood at her gate counting the rails that needed mending and finding, as she did most mornings now, that the number was higher than her hands could answer in one day. She was 31, widowed 19 months. The homestead had belonged to her husband's people before it belonged to anyone. 160 acres of Montana grass that Caleb Quinn had broken his back proving up, and that his death had left her holding with a son, not yet 4, and a note at the Bannock County bank that came due each spring whether the calves had fattened or not. She had 2 cows in milk, 11 hens, and a boy named Wyatt who followed her everywhere with the seriousness of a much older child. She had a rifle she knew how to use, and a smokehouse she'd built herself the autumn after the funeral, plank by plank, because nobody offered, and she had stopped waiting to be offered. What she did not have, this particular morning, was a coat that kept the wind out, her own having gone to patches 2 winters back and never quite recovered. She felt it most at the gate, where there was nothing between her and the open country but distance. The man came through around midday, riding the section road that ran along her north fence, on his way to nowhere she could name. She watched him a while before he noticed her watching. He sat a horse the way some men sit a porch chair, like the question of comfort had been settled a long time ago and wasn't worth revisiting. When he drew level with her gate, he slowed, then stopped, which she had not expected and did not entirely welcome. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He looked at the fence rail she'd been working, then at her hands, red from the cold and from the wire. He did not look at her face longer than was decent, which she noted and filed away as either good manners or indifference. She couldn't yet tell which. "Are you cold?" he asked. It was such a plain question that it took her a moment to answer it. Men in Bannock County did not generally ask a woman whether she was cold. They commented on the weather in the abstract, as though it were happening to the county and not to the person standing in it. "I'm working," she said, which was not an answer, and they both knew it. He nodded like she'd told him something useful. "Name's Thomas Garner. I've got the old Hollis place, 3 miles east." He didn't offer more than that, and didn't ask for more than her name in return, which she gave him because there seemed no reason not to. "Sarah Quinn." "Quinn." He said it the way a man says a name he's already heard somewhere, turning it over to check it against what he knew. "I knew your husband some. Bought a horse off him 2 years back. Sound animal." He paused. "I was sorry to hear. Most everybody was," she said, for a while. He didn't flinch at that, which she appreciated more than she let show. He touched his hat, said he'd best be getting on, and rode east toward the Hollis place with nothing further said. She went back to the fence and didn't think about him again until she was halfway through supper, when Wyatt asked who the man on the horse had been, and she found she had no good answer beyond a name and a question about the cold that she hadn't expected and still hadn't entirely answered for herself. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Hollis place had stood empty 3 years before Thomas Garner bought it, which made him a recent enough arrival that the county hadn't finished deciding what to make of him. He kept to himself, mostly. He'd come from somewhere south, Wyoming territory by the sound of it, though he didn't offer the particulars, and nobody had found the nerve to ask outright. He ran cattle competently and paid his debts on time, which in a county that judged a man chiefly by those 2 facts ought to have settled the matter. It hadn't, quite, because a man who kept to himself in Bannock County was a man people felt entitled to an opinion about. Sarah had her own history with the county's opinions. When Caleb died, thrown from a green horse he'd had no business mounting in March mud, the talk had moved through the valley, with the particular speed that talk reserves for widows. Her mother-in-law, Edith Quinn, had come out from town inside the week to take stock of the place as though it were already an estate to be settled rather than a woman's home to be respected, and had said, standing in Sarah's own kitchen with her gloves still on, that a young woman alone on 160 acres was a young woman who would need looking after, by which she meant the land looked after, and the woman moved somewhere more convenient. Sarah had said she'd manage. Edith had said that was what young women always said. Then she'd left, and the help she'd implied might follow had not followed, beyond a card at Christmas and a standing invitation to send the boy to town for his schooling, which Sarah understood to mean send the boy and keep the land out of it. The bank had been plainer about its terms. Mr. Aldous Penny, who ran the Bannock County Bank with the careful courtesy of a man delivering bad news in good clothes, had explained that the note Caleb signed carried through to the widow, as notes generally did, and that the spring payment would be expected regardless of circumstance. Circumstance being his word for everything that had happened to her in the past 19 months, reduced to a single syllable. She had not cried in front of him. She had cried in the wagon on the way home, once, briefly, and had not done it again where anyone could see. What she had, instead of help, was work, and she did it. She milked, she mended, she put up what she could against winter, and she taught Wyatt his letters at the kitchen table by lamp, because there was no school close enough to make the ride worth a 4-year-old's while. She had stopped, somewhere in the second winter, expecting the county to soften toward her, and had found that the stopping made the days easier to get through, if not easier altogether. Thomas Garner came by again 11 days after the fence, this time with a reason that wasn't really a reason. He said he'd noticed her north fence sagged in 3 places and offered, in the plain way he seemed to do everything, to help her reset the posts before the ground froze hard enough to make the work impossible. She told him she could manage it herself. He said he didn't doubt it, and then said he had nothing better to do with a Tuesday, and would consider it a favor if she let him anyway. She let him. They worked the fence line together through the cold afternoon, him digging where the post holes had gone to ice, and her holding the rails steady, and they didn't talk much beyond what the work required. Around 3 he asked if she'd eaten, and she admitted she hadn't, and he said neither had he, and somehow that turned into him sitting at her kitchen table eating bread and bacon, while Wyatt studied him from the doorway with the frank assessment small children make of strangers. "You've got a good boy," Thomas said. "I do. Quiet. He talks plenty when there's someone worth talking to." Thomas looked at Wyatt, who had crept a little closer to the table, drawn by curiosity past the point his shyness could hold him back. "What's your horse's name?" Wyatt asked, which was the first thing he'd said directly to the man, and Thomas answered him seriously, the way he seemed to answer everything, and told him the gelding was called Buck, and had a habit of stealing apples off the porch rail, if you weren't careful where you set them. Wyatt considered this information with great gravity, and asked if Buck might like a carrot instead, and Thomas said he expected Buck would take whatever was offered, and be grateful for it, and that was the start of something, though none of them could have named it yet. He left before dark. He did not linger at the door the way some men might, working up to a question that wasn't his to ask. He simply thanked her for the meal, told Wyatt to mind the fence didn't fall down again before he got back through, and rode east. She found herself, 3 days later, watching the section road more than the work in front of her, and was annoyed at herself for it, and watched anyway. He came by with a reason most weeks after that. Once it was the fence again, a stretch he claimed he'd missed the first time. Once it was a sack of flour he said he'd bought too much of in town and didn't want to see go to waste, though she suspected, looking at the quantity, that no bachelor cooking for himself bought 4 sacks of flour by accident. Once it was nothing at all, just Buck turned up the lane and Thomas Garner behind him, saying he'd been riding the section line anyway and thought he'd see how the fence was holding. The fence, by then, was holding very well, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. What she noticed, in the weeks that followed, was the particular shape his kindness took. He never offered her money outright, which she would have refused on principle, and he seemed to understand that without being told. He brought instead the kind of help that left something behind without asking for credit. A load of split wood stacked by her shed on a morning she hadn't seen him come or go. A new latch on the henhouse door after the old one had finally given out. Once, in early December, a length of good wool blanket left folded on her porch rail with no note, which she knew had come from him because nobody else in the county had reason to leave such a thing, and which she used that very night because the nights had turned hard and pride did not keep a person warm. She made him a pie in return, the first week of December, and left it on his own porch rail when she rode past the Hollis place on her way to town, not stopping to see whether he was home, because there was something in the giving and not staying that felt safer than the alternative. He found her at the penny mercantile 2 days later, and thanked her for it, with more sincerity than the gesture strictly warranted, and she understood that the pie had mattered to him in some way that went past the eating of it, and she let herself feel pleased about that for the length of the ride home. It was Edith Quinn who said something first, because Edith Quinn generally did. She came out in mid-December, ostensibly to see her grandson before the roads closed, and found reason within the hour to mention that she'd heard talk in town about a man riding regular out to the Quinn place, and that talk, regular as it was, tended to settle into something a sensible woman ought to consider before it settled into something she couldn't take back. He's helped with the fence, Sarah said. Fences don't need help every week of December, Sarah. This one apparently does. Edith set her teacup down with the particular precision of a woman choosing not to say the next three things that came to mind. Caleb's been gone less than 2 years. I'm aware of how long Caleb's been gone. I only mean to say that people watch a widow closer than they watch a married woman, and they're less forgiving of what they see. Edith looked at her hands. I don't say that to be cruel. I know you don't, Sarah said, and meant it, mostly, and still felt the old tightness in her chest that Edith's visits generally left behind, the sense of being managed rather than minded. Wyatt, very small and very direct, the comparison her mother-in-law withheld, chose that moment to ask whether Mr. Garner was coming Saturday, because Buck liked the carrots, and Wyatt had been saving the good ones. Edith's mouth did something complicated. She did not raise the subject again before she left, but the silence she left in its place said most of what the words might have. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The bank's letter came the second week of January, earlier than she'd braced for, stating in Mr. Penny's careful hand that the spring note would be called due on the 1st of April, rather than allowed to run to its original June term, owing to what the letter described as a reassessment of the bank's lending position in light of the difficult winter, which Sarah understood to mean that someone with more capital and less patience had made Mr. Penny an offer for the paper, and Mr. Penny had decided his own comfort outweighed hers. She did the arithmetic at the kitchen table that night after Wyatt was asleep, and the arithmetic did not improve no matter which way she turned it. The calves wouldn't be ready to sell before May at the earliest. The egg money covered flour and little beyond it. She had, if she sold the second milk cow and every hen but 4, perhaps 2/3 of what April would demand, and no clear notion where the remaining third might come from. Short of selling land she had no intention of selling, while there was breath left in her. She did not tell Thomas Garner about the letter. She told herself this was because it wasn't his concern, and knew, somewhere under the telling, that it was also because she was afraid of what it might look like to ask, afraid of becoming one more piece of trouble a kind man felt obliged to fix. He found out anyway, the way things found their way around Bannock County, through Mr. Penny's clerk, who mentioned it to the man at the feed store, who mentioned it to nearly everyone, including, eventually, Thomas Garner, who rode out the following Tuesday with his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen on him before. You should have told me, he said, before he'd even gotten down off Buck. It isn't your debt. I didn't say it was my debt. He dismounted, stood holding the reins, looking at her with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite anything she had a ready name for. I said you should have told me. What would you have done, Thomas? He didn't answer right away, which told her the question had landed somewhere he hadn't fully worked out himself yet. I don't rightly know, he admitted, but I'd have known, and that's not nothing. She found, standing there in the cold with him, that she believed him, and that the believing frightened her a little, because it had been a long time since she'd let herself believe a man's intentions toward her were as plain as they appeared, and the wanting to believe it now felt like a door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk back through. The talk in town sharpened after that, the way talk does when there's a deadline attached to it. Mrs. Caswell at the dry goods store asked Sarah, with an expression arranged to look like concern, whether it was true the bank was calling her note, and whether it was true Mr. Garner had been seen at the Quinn place often enough that people had started keeping count, and whether Sarah had given any thought to what the county might assume about a woman who took help so readily from a man not her husband. Sarah said the county was welcome to assume what it liked, and paid for her thread, and left without further comment, though her hands were not entirely steady on the reins for the first mile home. Wyatt, riding in front of her, asked why Mrs. Caswell had looked at her like that, and Sarah said some people in town liked to worry about things that weren't theirs to worry about, and Wyatt accepted this with the easy logic of a child and went back to naming the fence posts as they passed, which was a game he had invented and played with great seriousness, and which Sarah found, that particular afternoon, did more to settle her than any answer she might have given Mrs. Caswell. Edith came again at the end of January, this time with less preamble. She had heard, she said, about the note being called, and she had heard, she said, about Thomas Garner's regular visits, and she wished to say plainly that she did not think it proper for Sarah to accept a man's continued help under circumstances that might come to look, to anyone watching, like a debt being paid in a manner that wasn't strictly financial. Sarah stood very still when she heard that, and then asked her mother-in-law to leave, and Edith left, and the visit was not repeated for some weeks, which suited them both. Thomas came 2 days after that conversation, before Sarah had told anyone what Edith had said, and found her at the woodpile working out something with the axe that had less to do with firewood than with the noise in her own head. He didn't ask what was wrong. He picked up the second axe, the one that mostly hung idle against the shed wall, and split alongside her until the pile was higher than either of them strictly needed, and somewhere in the rhythm of that shared, wordless work, the noise in her head settled enough that she could speak. "People are saying things," she said. "People generally are. About you. About what your help is meant to buy." He set the axe down. "And what do you think it's meant to buy?" She looked at him a long moment, the cold air sharp between them, Wyatt's voice carrying faintly from inside, where he was narrating some private game to nobody in particular. "I think," she said slowly, "that I don't know yet, and that not knowing is starting to matter more than I want it to." He didn't press her further on it. He picked up the axe again, and they finished the woodpile, and he stayed for supper, and when he left he held her gaze a moment longer than usual at the door, long enough that something passed between them that neither of them put words to, and then he rode east into the dark, and she stood on the porch a while after his shape had gone, feeling the cold less than she had any right to. February brought the worst of the winter and, with it, the worst of the talk. The Reverend's wife, Mrs. Holloway, raised the matter at the sewing circle in terms gentle enough on their surface and pointed enough underneath, wondering aloud whether it might not be wiser, for the sake of the boy's reputation as much as the mother's, for Sarah to discourage Mr. Garner's visits until a more seemly interval had passed. Several of the women present agreed, in the careful way women agree when they want the credit for concern without the burden of saying it outright themselves. Sarah was not at the circle to hear it directly. She heard it secondhand, from a woman who thought she ought to know, and the knowing sat in her chest for the better part of a week, heavy and cold in a way the actual winter wasn't. She nearly told Thomas not to come, the second Saturday of February. She stood at the gate with the words half-formed, watching him ride up the section road in weather that would have kept a less determined man home, and found, when he drew level with her, that the words wouldn't come, because the truth underneath them was that she did not want him to stop coming, and pretending otherwise to spare the county's opinion of her felt, suddenly, like a worse betrayal of herself than anything the county imagined she'd already done. "You look like a woman working up to telling me something," he said, dismounting. "I am." "Go on then. They're saying I shouldn't let you keep coming. That it isn't proper. That it's bad for Wyatt. What people will think." He was quiet a moment, considering this with the same gravity he gave everything. "What do you want, Sarah?" It was the question nobody else had asked her in 19 months. Not the bank, not Edith, not Mrs. Holloway with her careful concern. What do you want? Not what was owed, not what was proper, not what the county would tolerate. "I don't know that anyone's asked me that since Caleb died," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady saying it. "I'm asking now." She looked at the gate, the fence he'd helped her mend, the lane he'd ridden up more times that winter than she could easily count anymore. "I want you to keep coming," she said. "I want it more than I'm comfortable wanting anything right now, and I don't know what to do with that, because the note's still due in April, and I can't think past it most days. And it doesn't seem fair to you, wanting something from a woman who's got nothing settled to offer back. I haven't asked you for anything settled. I know. That's part of what frightens me." He stepped closer, not pressing, just closing the distance enough that the words between them didn't have to carry as far. "Then let me say something plain, and you can do with it what you like. I'm not riding out here for the fence, and I expect you've known that a while. I'm not asking you to marry me to settle a banknote, because I'd be ashamed of myself if that's what this turned into. I'm asking because I'd like to keep coming, regular, for the rest of however many Saturdays we've got, and I'd like, someday when the note isn't sitting over both our heads, to ask you something with a clean conscience instead of a complicated one." She felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since the letter came. "And until then I'll keep riding out, and you'll keep telling Mrs. Holloway and anyone else what they can do with their opinions, and we'll get that note paid between the two of us in whatever fool way two stubborn people manage it, and we won't call it anything we don't mean." She found she was smiling, the first real smile in longer than she'd tracked. "That's a great deal of plain speaking for one cold afternoon. I had it stored up. The note came due on the 1st of April, and it was paid in full, 3 days early, through a combination that nobody in the county fully untangled, and that Sarah and Thomas never explained beyond the bare facts. The second cow sold at a fair price to a rancher near Dillon, every cent of egg money saved since January, and a loan from Thomas himself, structured plainly as a loan with terms written down and witnessed by Mr. Penny's own clerk, so that no one, least of all Sarah, could mistake it for anything but what it was. One neighbor, helping another through a hard season, with the expectation of being paid back, which she fully intended to do and eventually did. Mr. Penny, accepting the final payment, allowed that he was glad to see the matter settled, and did not meet her eyes while saying it, which she took for the closest thing to an apology she was likely to get, and decided to accept it as such. Edith came out again in May, this time without preamble of any kind, and found Sarah and Thomas in the side yard, him teaching Wyatt to sit a saddle properly, while Sarah hung washing on the line, and stood watching the three of them a long moment before she said, in a voice considerably softer than her usual register, that the boy looked well. That he looked, in fact, like a boy who had something he hadn't had in a while, and that she supposed, having looked at it plainly, she'd been wrong to assume the worst of a man who'd done nothing but show up, week after week, when showing up cost him something, and gained him nothing certain in return. Sarah said she appreciated her saying so. Edith said it had taken her longer than it should have, and that this was the particular failing of people who'd had their own hearts broken once, and spent the rest of their lives flinching on other people's behalf. And Sarah found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she could forgive her mother-in-law for that, now that the worst of the winter was behind them, and there was room in her chest for forgiving. Thomas asked her properly in June, on a Saturday evening with the light going gold over the western ridge, and Wyatt asleep early after a long day of riding lessons. He didn't make a speech of it. He said he'd told her once he'd ask when his conscience was clean of the bank note and every other complication, and the note was paid, and his conscience, such as it was, felt about as clean as he expected it ever would. Marry me, Sarah, not because the place needs a hand, though it could use one. Not because the boy needs a father, though I'd be glad to be one to him. Because I'd like to come home to you every evening instead of riding 3 miles back to an empty house. And because I think, if you'll let me, I could make you glad of that arrangement too. She thought of the gate where he'd first asked if she was cold. She thought of the blanket on the porch rail with no note attached, and the pie she'd left on his without staying to see his face when he found it, and the long winter of Saturdays that had turned, somewhere along the way, from help into something neither of them needed to name to understand. I'm not cold anymore, she said, which was not quite an answer and was entirely an answer, and he understood it the way he seemed to understand most things. She didn't say outright, and reached for her hand, and she let him take it. They married in September, at the small church in Bannock with perhaps 40 people in the pews, which Edith Quinn attended in a hat Sarah had never seen before and cried through without apology, sitting beside Wyatt, who held her hand through the ceremony with the same easy confidence he'd once used to ask a stranger his horse's name. Mrs. Holloway came, and brought a dish to the supper after, and said nothing further on the subject of propriety, which Sarah understood to be its own kind of apology, offered in the only language the woman knew how to offer it. The Hollis place was sold that autumn, and Thomas moved his cattle and his few belongings onto the Quinn land for good, and the gate where he'd once asked a cold woman a plain question got a new latch that winter, fixed by his own hand on a Saturday morning, with Wyatt holding the tools and asking more questions than the job strictly required. Sarah kept the wool blanket he'd left her that first winter folded at the foot of their bed, not for warmth any longer, since the house held heat well enough now with 2 working it instead of 1, but because some things earn their place by being the first of what came after, and she found she wasn't inclined to put it away. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.